April 1945, outside Kassel, Germany. A Luftwaffe mechanic thought he'd be executed. He was just 23 years old. He waited for the final command. But instead of a rifle, an American sergeant offered a wrench. He was ordered to repair a P-51 Mustang. He'd been told they'd shoot him as a saboteur. Instead, they trusted him with their finest machine. This single act of battlefield mercy, however, came with a hidden price. A truth he would not understand for decades. When your enemy honors your skill, but your own people call it treason, what does mercy truly mean? We invite you to share your city and local time in the comments. We want to know how far these testimonies travel. If stories of quiet dignity matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet exhaustion of an engine run dry. For Karl Weber, a 23-year-old Luftwaffe mechanic, it arrived in the muddy fields outside Kassel in April 1945. The German front had not bent, it had shattered. What was left of his unit was now just a line of weary men in grey uniforms, hands laced behind their heads, shuffled into a makeshift prisoner of war pen, ringed by American armor. Karl kept his eyes down, focused on the damp soil that clung to his worn boots. He expected the worst. For 3 years, since his conscription in 1942, the stories had been hammered into him at the air depot near Erfurt. Political officers, their voices sharp and certain, had painted vivid pictures of capture. They said the Americans, and especially their airmen, gave no quarter to Luftwaffe ground crews. Mechanics were not soldiers to be captured, they were saboteurs to be shot. You keep their enemy in the air, the officers warned, and you will pay for it on the ground. Karl braced himself, waiting for the shove, the shouted order, the metallic click of a rifle bolt that would signal his final moment. He had replayed this scene in his mind 100 times, a grim certainty that had become a part of his wartime existence. An American sergeant with a tired face and stripes on his sleeve moved down the line of prisoners. He was not looking for defiance or resistance. He was looking for something else. His eyes, pragmatic and appraising, scanned the men, pausing on Karl. The sergeant was not tall, but he carried an authority that needed no height. He stopped directly in front of Karl, and for a long second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Karl tensed, his shoulders tightening. This was it. But the American's hands were not reaching for a sidearm. Instead, he turned and barked a command to another soldier, who returned lugging a heavy steel toolbox. The sergeant took it, the metal groaning under the weight. With a grunt, he pushed it squarely into Karl's chest. The sudden, unexpected force knocked the air from Karl's lungs. He stumbled back, catching the box by instinct. It was greasy, solid, and filled with the familiar, clanking weight of tools. The sergeant didn't speak. He simply jerked his head toward the temporary airstrip, where a row of American fighter planes stood like silver predators. He pointed a finger at one of them, a P-51 Mustang, its elegant, deadly lines now marred by a bent propeller blade. The instruction was unspoken but perfectly clear. You are a mechanic. This is a machine. Fix it. A profound confusion washed over Karl, so potent it momentarily erased his fear. He looked from the sergeant's impassive face to the damaged aircraft, and then down at the toolbox in his hands. These were American tools, meant for American engines. For years, his entire world had been dedicated to the maintenance of Messerschmitt 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. He knew their engines intimately, could diagnose a tremor or a cough by sound alone. His hands understood the precise tension of German bolts, the unique feel of German steel. The Allison V-1710 engine inside that P-51 was the heart of the machine that had systematically destroyed his homeland's air power. He was supposed to hate it. He was supposed to fear the men who flew it. Instead, he was being asked to heal it. He walked toward the aircraft, his steps unsteady in the mud. The smell hit him first, the sharp, clean scent of high-octane fuel and warm engine oil, a fragrance as familiar to him as the smell of his mother's kitchen. It was the scent of his trade, a smell that transcended uniforms and battle lines. He placed the toolbox on the ground and ran a hesitant hand over the Mustang's metal skin. It was cool to the touch, smooth and impossibly well made. His fingers, trembling just slightly, found the latch on the toolbox and lifted the lid. Inside lay a set of socket wrenches, pliers, and calipers. They were foreign in design, but universal in purpose. He picked up a wrench, its weight a comforting presence in his palm. His training, drilled into him over thousands of hours in the Airfort depot, took over. The fear receded, replaced by the calm, methodical process of problem-solving. A bent propeller blade was a serious issue, one that could tear an engine from its mounting if not addressed. He began his assessment, his mind shutting out the war, the prison pen, the uncertain future. There was only the problem in front of him, the physics of stressed metal, the geometry of torque and balance. As he worked, he could feel the American sergeant's eyes on him. But the gaze was not one of suspicion. It was the watchful, knowing look of one craftsman observing another. Carl realized the stories he had been told, the propaganda meant to steel his spine with hatred and fear, were beginning to crumble. They were lies. There was no execution squad waiting for him. The reality of his capture was not a bullet, but a job. In the heart of his enemy's camp, surrounded by the very machines he had been trained to view as targets, Carl Weber was being offered, not punishment, but a strange and unexpected form of respect. His world, once built on the iron certainty of kill or be killed, was cracking open. He was a prisoner, yes, but in that moment, with a heavy American wrench in his hand, he was also something more. He was a mechanic, and he had work to do. The initial shock of that first day bled into a new, surreal routine. By early May of 1945, Carl was no longer an anonymous prisoner waiting in a muddy pen. He was a fixture in a bustling American hangar, a strange ghost in a Luftwaffe uniform, moving among the olive drab of the U.S. Army Air Force's ground crew. He was assigned to the 9th Air Force, specifically the 362nd Fighter Group, a unit that was perpetually busy patching up its P-51 seconds and P-47 Thunderbolts for the final push into Germany. Carl learned the rhythms of this new life quickly. He worked side by side with American mechanics, men whose names he slowly learned. There was Sergeant Donnelly, the one who had first handed him the toolbox, a pragmatic man from Kansas who judged everyone by the quality of their work. Donnelly seemed to carry a dry wit that eased the tension in the hangar, and he nicknamed Carl Mac, a common name for any mechanic, which somehow felt more inclusive than being called by his German name. Carl found a silent camaraderie in their shared language of machinery. He taught them little tricks he had mastered in Erfurt, ways to stretch the life of a worn-out engine part, how to listen for the subtle vibrations that warned of future failure. In return, the Americans showed him their own efficient methods, their abundance of tools and spare parts a stark contrast to the scarcity he had known. One morning, a young private brought him a steaming mug of black coffee. It was the first hot drink he had tasted in weeks, and the warmth spread through him, a simple act of humanity that felt more powerful than any treaty. He learned that his situation, while extraordinary to him, was governed by rules. The camp commander, in a brief address to the skilled prisoners, quoted the Geneva Convention. He specifically mentioned Article 31, which stated that prisoners of war could be required to work, as long as it was not directly related to combat operations. For thousands of captured Luftwaffe personnel at this late stage of the war, this meant clearing rubble or salvaging wrecked airfields. U.S. policy, driven more by practicality than vengeance, stressed using these men to restore infrastructure. Yet for Carl and a select few others, the work was different. They weren't digging ditches, they were keeping fighters in the air. The line between non-combat support and direct military aid felt thin, but no one questioned it. The Americans needed planes to fly, and Carl knew how to fix them. He found a scrap of cigarette paper and a pencil stub, and in the quiet of his bunk, he wrote down the thought that kept circling his mind. "I was told they would beat me," he wrote in small, neat letters. "Instead, they call me Mac." But this fragile peace was not universal. Not every American GI shared Sergeant Donnelly's practical view. One afternoon, as Carl was adjusting a carburetor, a corporal named Frank Miller spat on the concrete floor near his boots. The corporal was a quiet, brooding man from Chicago who had lost a brother in the Ardennes. He never spoke directly to Carl, but his resentment was a palpable force in the hangar. He would mutter the word Kraut, just loud enough for Carl to hear, a constant, low-level reminder that he was, and always would be, the enemy. The tension spiked when a rumor rippled through the base. A German prisoner at a nearby airfield had deliberately sabotaged an engine, causing it to fail on takeoff. The pilot had survived, but the incident coated every interaction with a fresh layer of suspicion. Suddenly, Carl felt eyes on him wherever he went. Every bolt he tightened, every wire he connected, was now being watched. The trust that had been offered felt conditional, ready to be revoked at the slightest mistake. He worked with even more meticulous care, double-checking and triple-checking his own repairs, knowing that the safety of a pilot and the fragile dignity he had been granted both rested on his hands. The ultimate test came a few days later. A P-51 Mustang had returned from a mission with its Allison engine running rough, trailing a thin plume of black smoke. For 2 days, the American crew had struggled to diagnose the problem. Finally, Sergeant Donnelly waved Carl over. He trusted Carl's ear for engines. Carl spent hours listening, testing, and methodically eliminating possibilities until he traced the issue to a fault deep within the fuel intake system, a subtle flaw the others had missed. He worked through the night to repair it. The next morning, a crowd gathered as Lieutenant Hayes, the young pilot, climbed into the cockpit to test the engine. He gave Carl a brief, tense nod. When he started the engine, it did not cough or sputter. It roared to life with a clean, powerful sound that echoed across the airfield. A spontaneous cheer went up from the American mechanics. Lieutenant Hayes gave a thumbs up from the cockpit, a wide grin spreading across his face. When he climbed down, he walked directly over to Carl, his face still flushed with relief. He clapped a hand firmly on Carl's shoulder. "You kept us flying," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. In that moment, the whispers and the suspicion melted away. Carl was not a Kraut. He was not a saboteur. He was the man who had saved the Mustang. It was a shocking, exhilarating feeling to be seen and valued not for the uniform he wore, but for the skill he possessed. The praise from the American pilot was a shield Carl carried with him through the following weeks. It deflected the lingering glares from Corporal Miller and insulated him from the quiet suspicion that still haunted the edges of the camp. But that shield began to feel thin when the news arrived on May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. A strange quiet fell over the airfield. The frantic pace of repairs slowed, then stopped altogether. The constant roar of engines taking off and landing was replaced by an unsettling stillness. For the Americans, it was a moment of profound relief, of letters home filled with promises of return. For Carl, it was the beginning of a new and terrifying uncertainty. He should have felt relief, too. The killing was over. He had survived. Yet a cold dread settled in his stomach. The war had given him a purpose, even in captivity. His skill was valuable. Now that the fighting was done, what was he? He was no longer a useful asset. He was just a German prisoner, a member of a defeated army in a ruined country. The mercy he had been shown was a product of wartime necessity. He couldn't help but wonder, would mercy end with peace? The days bled into a long, quiet summer. The 362nd Fighter Group was gone, moved on to other duties. Carl and the other remaining prisoners were transferred to a larger processing camp, where the routine was one of waiting. This period of limbo was governed by international law. Unlike the German prisoners captured by the Soviets on the Eastern Front, who faced years of brutal labor and starvation in the gulags, those in American and British custody were processed according to the Geneva Convention. They were to be treated humanely and repatriated as soon as was practical. But back in what was left of Germany, a different story was taking shape. Among the civilian population, who had endured years of bombing and deprivation, there was a growing bitterness. They saw the soldiers returning from Allied prison camps not as heroes who had endured, but as men who had been fed and clothed by the enemy while their own families starved. The word traitor began to be whispered in the ruins of German cities, a poison aimed at those who had survived captivity too comfortably. Carl knew nothing of this. He only knew the waiting, the endless counting of days until he could go home. Finally, in the late summer of 1945, his name was called. He was being sent home. He was loaded onto a truck with dozens of other men, a silent cargo of former soldiers heading back to a life they could no longer imagine. The journey eastward took them through a landscape of devastation. Cities that had once been proud centers of culture were now hollowed-out skeletons of stone and twisted steel. Carl tried to hold onto a fragile seed of hope. He was going home to his village in Thuringen. He imagined seeing his father, his sister. He imagined the familiar shape of his street, the taste of well water, the feeling of sleeping in his own bed. He was not returning a victor, but he was returning alive. Surely, that was enough. The truck left him at a crossroads a few kilometers from his village. He walked the rest of the way, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He crested the final hill and looked down. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. His village was gone. Or rather, it was a ghost of what it had been. A bombing raid, aimed at a nearby railway junction months earlier, had missed its target. Entire streets were now just heaps of rubble. He found his family's home, or what was left of it, a collapsed roof and a single, defiant wall. His sister was there, living in the cellar. She was gaunt, her eyes holding a deep, weary sadness that made her look 20 years older. She told him their father was dead, killed in that same raid. The news struck Carl with a dull, physical force. He had been so focused on his own survival that he had never truly considered this. While he was being treated with a strange decency by his enemies, his own family had been living through hell. He tried to rebuild, to find his place in this new, broken world. But something was wrong. The neighbors, the people he had grown up with, looked at him with a coldness he couldn't understand. Then the whispers started. They were quiet at first, exchanged over garden fences and in the queue for bread rations. Someone had heard about his work in the American camp. "He fixed planes for them," a woman muttered, loud enough for him to hear. "While our sons were dying, he was helping the enemy." The story twisted as it spread. He hadn't just repaired planes, he had willingly collaborated. The very act that had given him a sense of dignity in captivity now became the brand of his shame. The respect from Sergeant Donnelly, the grateful clap on the shoulder from Lieutenant Hayes, these moments became a secret he had to bury. They were proof not of mercy, but of betrayal. He hid the memory away, never speaking of it. He wrote nothing of his time in the hangar in his family's chronicle. Lying awake at night in the damp cellar, listening to the wind whistle through the ruins of his home, a single, agonizing question haunted him. Was the mercy he received ever real? Or was it just another trick of war? Years turned into decades. Carl Weber rebuilt his life from the rubble, brick by painstaking brick. He married, had children, and opened a small workshop repairing farm equipment. The scarred landscape of post-war Germany slowly healed around him, the ruins cleared and replaced by new, practical buildings. The economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, brought a fragile prosperity back to the land. But inside Carl, a small part of the war remained unsettled. The memory of the American hangar, of the coffee, of the pilot's praise, was locked away in a deep, silent part of his mind. It was a source of profound shame, a secret he guarded even from his own wife. He could not explain the feeling, the complicated knot of pride and guilt that tightened in his chest whenever he thought of it. How could he describe the dignity he felt fixing an enemy plane when that same enemy's bombs had taken his father? How could he speak of the kindness of a few American soldiers when the collective story of his people was one of suffering and defeat? It was easier to say nothing, to let the past remain buried. He attended veterans' gatherings, somber affairs, where old men would gather to drink beer and reminisce. They would speak of battles, of comrades lost, of the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. They told stories of combat, of defiance, of fighting to the bitter end. Carl would sit quietly, nursing his drink, a ghost in their midst. When they asked him what he did in the war, he would mumble something vague about being a mechanic. He never mentioned the P-51 seconds. He was ashamed to admit that his war had not ended in a blaze of glory or a defiant last stand, but with the quiet, methodical work of his hands on an American engine. The story he carried was one of mercy, not of conflict, and in the world he now lived in, there seemed to be no honor in that. One day, nearly 20 years after the war had ended, a package arrived from a distant cousin who had emigrated to America. Inside was a book, a recently published memoir written by a retired U.S. Air Force pilot. His name was Robert Hayes. The cover showed a younger version of the man Carl remembered, grinning from the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang. Carl's hands shook as he opened it. He scanned the pages, his eyes darting through tales of dogfights and bombing runs, until he found a chapter describing the final days of the war in Germany. And there, in black and white, he found a story he thought had been forgotten by everyone but him. Lieutenant Hayes wrote about the exhaustion of the ground crews, the constant struggle to keep the fighters airworthy, with dwindling supplies. He then described a moment at a makeshift airfield near Kassel. He wrote of a captured German mechanic, a quiet young man whose name he never knew, who had been put to work on their planes. He described how this prisoner had single-handedly diagnosed and repaired a critical engine problem on his Mustang, a plane the American crew had nearly given up on. That German mechanic saved 3 of our Mustangs when parts were short, Hayes had written. He worked with a skill and a focus you had to respect. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a craftsman. He kept us flying. Carl read the passage again, and then a third time. The words on the page felt like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 2 decades. He kept us flying. The shame that had clung to him for so long, the heavy weight of his neighbor's accusations, began to lift. In the eyes of the man whose life had depended on his work, his actions had not been treason. They had been respected, remembered. It was a small mention in a long book, a footnote in one man's history of a vast and terrible war. But for Karl, it was everything. It was validation. It was proof that the mercy he had received was real, not a trick. It was a testament to the idea that honor could be found not just in fighting, but in building. It was not in the act of destroying a machine, but in the skill and restraint required to preserve one. The true conflict had never been between him and the Americans in that hangar. It had been between the brutal myths of propaganda and the quiet truth of a shared humanity. He finally understood that his small act of professional integrity had been a victory of its own, a silent defiance against the hatred the war demanded from everyone. He went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed, a chest that held the few possessions he had carried through his life. From beneath a pile of folded wool blankets, he pulled out a tool wrapped in an oily cloth. It was a wrench, heavy and worn, its steel pitted with age. It was the wrench Sergeant Donnelly had placed in his hands all those years ago. He had kept it, hidden away, an object that was both a source of pride and a symbol of his secret shame. He unwrapped it now and held it in his hands. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a medal. It was not an iron cross for valor in combat, but something quieter, something more profound. It was a symbol of a different kind of courage. The courage to see the man instead of the uniform, to value skill over allegiance. He had been taught that his purpose was to serve a flag, but in that hangar he had served a higher calling, the simple, honest work of a craftsman. They handed me a tool when I expected a bullet, he thought to himself, the memory now clear and bright. And in that moment, I learned that mercy can build more than any machine.